Okay, in this video I'm going to move on from the last one where I was talking about the torque limitation or torque limit map here, and I'm going to move on a long way through the file. And the reason I'm going to move a long way is because I'm going to ignore all these maps. These are all injection maps, so I'm just going to move on and ignore all those for the moment. An awful lot of injection maps. These are all corrections for injection maps, so I'm going to go on past those, because what I want to do is to look at what, in my mind, is a more sensible view of injection, which is this one coming up. This is the injection duration, because the injection duration really gives me, and hopefully you, more of a feeling for what's going on. In other words, what we have here in the injection duration map is the time that the injector will be open to allow fuel to flow, and so we get big spikes for big numbers, which means the injector's open a long time, so we must be putting lots of fuel in, and little spikes for small amounts of time, so we're not putting in so much fuel. So it gives you a nice feel for the way the injection system is working. Now, this map often repeats several times. There might be one for injections, let's say, that are pilot injection. There might be one for main injection. There might be one for post injection. There might be another one for regeneration. So that's 4. Sometimes there can be multiple maps for pilot injection, multiple maps for main injection, multiple maps for post injection, and then still further regeneration maps. So you can have a lot of these duration maps, but in this particular file there's just one. So this one must be used for every different type of injection. So it doesn't matter what injection type you're using. Once you've calculated how much fuel you want to inject, you simply go and look it up on this map. Now, we've already looked and seen that there is a torque map. So in other words, we've already seen that we've got driver's wish map that gives us a value in torque, and then we've got a torque to IQ conversion map, which will turn the injection quantity required as in a torque value into an amount of fuel in milligrams. Now, that amount of fuel in milligrams needs to be then converted by the ECU into a volume of fuel, because this map takes in values of the actual volume of fuel. So not the amount of fuel as in the mass, as in what it weighs, so milligrams. This takes a value of milliliters or millimeters cubed of fuel. So it's not the weight or the mass of fuel, this is the actual volume of fuel. And you can usually spot this because if we look at the values, they very often go a little bit higher. So in other words, if this was going to peak at perhaps 60 milligrams of fuel, it's not a 1-to-1 ratio fuel to volume. The volume tends to be a bit higher than the actual weight, and so this will normally have an axis that's slightly higher than you would have seen on previous milligram axes. Now, if we look at this one, then what we've got here is we're still using 0.01. So we've got an injection quantity, but it's by volume, so it's millimeters cubed. We're still using 0.01 as we did with mass of milligrams per cycle. So that's what we're using, volume. On the side here, what we've got is the available rail pressure from the fuel pump putting pressure into the fuel rail, and this is generally going to rise with engine revs, so you can sort of say that engine revs are being taken into account at the same time. These values are massive, as you can see. We have got huge values here, and if we look at the reason why, the original value has been multiplied by 100, and again we're using millibars or HPA, and we have got massive high values, and that's what makes these fuel rails so dangerous. If you were to open one of these fuel rails while you were near it, this pressure would inject straight through your skin. That would be instantly very dangerous. as in terms of just making you ill, but if that fuel somehow gets injected into the blood system, I mean, you could even die as a result of it. So it's why these systems very often have warnings on them. These values are very high and they're very dangerous. So that's our very, very high pressure rail. So we've got our high pressure rail, lots of pressure, we've got the amount of fuel that we would like to inject, and so the values we've got in here are the amount of time for which the injector will be open. And if we look at this, the factor for this, and it can vary, but the factor that's being used here is 0.4. You sometimes have to find out what this factor is going to be, but a lot of ECUs use 0.4 here. These values can be a little bit confusing because we are looking at microseconds, so we are looking at very, very small numbers, but of course when we look at them they look like big numbers. So in other words, when we look at this number, let's say that says 290, but it's 290 microseconds, so it's a very, very small number. And the way the numbers work is pretty much obvious. If we look at it, if we don't want to inject very much fuel, we don't open the injector for very long, and if we want to inject a lot of fuel, we open the injector for a lot longer. And if we look at it, instead of going from left to right, if we look at it from top to bottom, we can see that here we've got less rail pressure and here we've got more rail pressure. So obviously as the rail pressure gets higher and higher and higher, we can inject the same amount of fuel, i.e. 78, but we can have the injector open for less time. Now in reality none of that really matters, because when you're driving it's highly unlikely that you're going to be jumping around from one value of, let's say, here to another value there and then another value over here, because generally speaking you're going to work your way through the values, aren't you? Because if you're accelerating, as you accelerate gently, then gradually you are going to want to raise the amount of fuel like this. So the amount of fuel is going up, and of course the side effect of the fuel going up is the engine revs will increase, and the other side effect of the engine revs increasing is that the fuel pressure in the rail is being raised anyway, and so you're constantly working your way diagonally across here. So although these figures over here mean that you could spend a lot less time injecting the fuel, in reality it doesn't matter, because that's not going to happen in the real world, because you're going to be over here somewhere on the map. So this map gives you a good feel for what's going on in the engine. You want to inject lots of fuel because you want to go fast, so you want to inject it as fast as you can, but it's obviously going to take longer than if you were injecting less fuel, so the injector will need to stay open longer than when you were injecting less fuel. So it's a very, very, very simple and obvious thing when you look at it in that way. Right, that's duration, so I will stop there.